Hello and welcome to the Sacred Science of Sound. I'm Geraldine Glass, and I am thrilled and excited to welcome American author and bridging science and spirituality, Gregg Braden. Gregg, welcome to this conversation today on the Sacred Science of Sound.
Hey, Geraldine, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I want to thank you for your trust, because the truth is when we do something like this, you never really know how this is going to come out. You don't know what I'm going to say. So you're trusting me right now, and I appreciate that. And I want to say welcome to our viewers. And I want to say I think it's a really important, it's an important summit. It's an important conference that we're having in this virtual format because of the role that sound has always played in each of our lives, even before birth, from the time of conception in our mother's womb. So I think it's important that we honor and acknowledge that, and where it makes sense to build upon these relationships so that we can become better people and create a better world. So thank you for your vision of putting this together and your dedication to make it all happen.
My great pleasure. So that's where I wanted to start. I wanted to ask you, when did you first recognize the transformational power of music in your own life?
Oh, wow. So you're going to start with the easy questions first, huh?
You're a brilliant scientist.
Well, I say that for this reason. You probably know that the most difficult thing for an author or a researcher to talk about is themselves and their own lives. It's much easier to talk about what they've discovered than to talk about their own lives. And I'm happy to share my story. So I think you're asking, when did I consciously become aware of the power of music? Is that, or the power of sound?
Yes, and the power of music and sound to make a transformation inside you. And I was very excited because you're known for your amazing work also with indigenous cultures and all the things that you're doing as a scientist and author, but you're also a musician.
I am. I was a musician long before I was ever an author. And so to answer that question, just a little bit of background in my life. I was born in the mid 20th century in a very conservative rural community in the U.S., in the state of Missouri, and into a very dysfunctional, abusive, alcoholic family. My father was the alcoholic; he was the abuser. My mom, my younger brother, and I, there were four of us in the family. We got the bad end of that deal. And music became a refuge for me, Geraldine, at a very early age. When I was 8 years old, we got the first radio in the house. And what I noticed was that what I heard on the radio, when I listened to what was happening on the radio, I felt different inside my body. And I didn't know why. I wasn't a scientist then, but I was astute enough to understand that something happened in the presence of that music that was not happening when the music wasn't there. But I have to tell you how naive. Now, this is how naive I was and this was in the 1950s, early 1960s, when I was listening to music. Okay, 1963, the Beatles were on the radio. I didn't understand how radio worked. And I assumed at my young age that every time I heard the Beatles play a song, that they were in a studio broadcasting that song, that they were playing live. And when I heard the song play heavy rotation, 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day, I thought, wow, how can they be playing that same song so many times from that studio, And the whole idea of vinyl and being able to record the music and play it at will, that was something that came along later. Mm-hmm. But what I noticed was, for me personally, it was a refuge. And I picked up a guitar when I was 8 years old. And one of the great epiphanies that came to me was what I realized was that my guitar had the same frets and the same strings as the guitars of the people that I was listening to on the radio. And that all I had to do was to understand what they were doing on those frets and strings to make the same sounds. I mean, that might sound very obvious to us today, but when you're a kid and you're listening to this stuff coming over the airwaves, and it transforms you so powerfully inside. When I heard that music, I was removed from my circumstances. I felt a lightness. I felt empowered. I felt my heart would race, and I felt this sense of harmony. It's like everything is okay when I was hearing that music. And that I had the potential, if I practiced and became really good, that I could recreate on my own what I was hearing those people do. And then it was at 10 years old, I had the opportunity to go to my first rock concert, and it was a Jefferson Airplane. That time it was the Airplane, then it became the Starship. So it was Jefferson Airplane. And I got to tell you, I sat on the front row of Memorial Hall, Kansas City, Kansas, and Grace Slick, the lead singer, was right in front of me, and I professed my love to her. I said, Grace Slick, I love you. And she completely blew me off, totally discounted me. But here's why I'm sharing the story. I looked around in that hall, and at that time there were around 20, 25, maybe 30,000 people that were in that hall. And I saw them, as different as they were in their lives and their circumstances and their backgrounds and their ages and their professions, something brought them together in that moment, and they were moved. And I saw them moved by a performance from these people up on the stage. And so I witnessed and I recognized this. I said, wow, look at the transformative power of music upon thousands of people in this place today. And I made a choice at that time in my life. I said, in some way, I would like to be able to communicate with thousands of people and make a powerful, positive difference in their lives through words and through music. And seeing that music was the first time I saw that happen. The next time was not with music, but it was with a motivational speaker. His name was Billy Graham. And I wasn't so much into Billy Graham's message. It was a good message. But what really, really influenced me, this was in an outdoor sports arena, 70,000 people. And this one man standing, a little tiny man that I could barely see, on a stage through the PA, what he was saying with his voice was moving these people, and it was making them think and feel differently about themselves and their relationship to the world. And when those thoughts changed, even when they left that arena, they thought and felt differently about themselves. And those two experiences, both at the age of 10, they both influenced me in my life. And I said, I'm either going to be a speaker or a rock star. I tried the rock star thing, and I learned very quickly, you don't want to make your living as a musician touring on the road. I can tell you a whole story about what that's all about. But I continue. I'm a musician today. My wife and I have a recording studio that we built into our home. My wife's a professional musician as well. And I have recognized in my life the most difficult times in my life, and I know our viewers can relate to this. One of the first things you do when you go through a tough time in your life is you'll find a song to latch onto, or you'll find a piece of music. Maybe there's no words, but you'll find sound to latch onto, whether it's the loss of a loved one, or whether it's the breakup of a relationship, or the healing of your body. And you'll play, that will be the soundtrack of your life for that period of time. You'll play it again and again. You'll drive people around you crazy because it doesn't have the same meaning for them that it has for you, or in this case, for me in my life. So music continues to be a powerful, motivating factor in my life. And I'll just tell you, my publisher doesn't like to hear this, but if the whole author gig doesn't work out, that's my plan B. I'm going to go back on the road as a musician. So I just have to say that I'm confessing right now. So that was a long answer to a short question.
No. And I'm going to ask you to go a little bit deeper, because same music it just has been such a great influence in my life. And I'm curious to ask you also, with your kind of schedule and all the deep work that you're doing and the sharing with thousands and thousands of people worldwide, how does music today, how do you find that it replenishes you after all that you're giving and all the intellectual work you're doing? How do you experience music as replenishing your own being? And then in doing that, how does it how do you experience it affecting others?
Sure. Well, I could answer it in two ways. First, I was younger. It wasn't so much of a conscious thing. It was just, if I was having a bad day, I'd turn on the song. And as I got older, I began to recognize the consistency of this relationship between the way I felt inside my body and the way I felt about myself, the world, and the way I looked at other people, and the power of a music to help me to find that place. And so rather than having it be anecdotal or being this occasional experience, I consciously incorporated it into my life in very concise, very precise, very predictable ways. So for example, my office now, when I'm writing a book, and it is a very intense process to bring through a book from wherever books come from, or wherever songs come from, in the field somewhere, to bring those through and actually create something with words or with sound. It's a very intense process. And so as part of my office, my music studio is right on the other side of this wall. And many times throughout the writing process, or if I'm in a big decision-making mode, I will leave my desk and my computer, or I'm in the studio right now, and I will walk into that music studio and I'll pick up one of my guitars and I'll begin playing. And what happens, Geraldine, for me, is that it immediately moves me out of my thinking mind, right, into my feeling heart. So the power of music, and indigenous people have known this for a long time, is it bypasses the thinking mind. It bypasses the filters that we have created consciously and subconsciously. So the filters of ego, the filters of doubt, the filters of self-doubt. When I sit down and write a book, somebody asked me recently, how does it feel to write something that's going to be read by possibly millions of people? And if I thought about that, I could never write the book because that's my mind and my ego saying, what right do you have to say what you're saying to possibly millions of people? But when I go and play the music, I'm out of my thinking mind, and the filters of self-doubt, the ego, there's still subconsciously the voice of my alcoholic father, the criticism that comes from that. I don't know that it ever goes away, but what I've found in my own life is I was blessed with what I call a very strong soul compass. And my soul compass, I would hear the criticism, but consciously I didn't believe it. So I never gave in to it. My younger brother did believe it, and it impacted his life in a negative way, that continued throughout his life. So although I consciously didn't buy into the criticism, I can't help but believe that subconsciously some of those patterns, are probably still there. So if I think about what I'm doing, that's where the self-doubt and the criticism, is where does that voice come from? It's the voice I've heard all my life. By engaging the music, I bypass all of that and then go directly into my heart. Now that's intuitively, I've always understood that worked. As a scientist, I now understand why it works. And we now know it works because we have specialized neurons only discovered in 91 and only published in 1994. I mean, this is pretty recent stuff. We have specialized neurons in the human heart they're like the neurons in the brain, but they're not in the brain. They think, feel, remember, and sense independently of the neurons in the brain. And they help us to make decisions, and they help us to gain insights and access to deep states of intuition in a very, very powerful way, and very different from the brain, because for the reasons I've just shared, because we bypass all of the ego, all the fear, all the lack of esteem or self-doubt that comes from the logic loops in the brain. You bypass all that, and we all know that. The music carries you right in the heart. Music makes the world go round. It's a universal language. So for example, I've spent a lot of my adult life working with indigenous people, indigenous traditions throughout the world to understand two things: what they know that we've forgotten, and what they know in their time that we're only beginning to discover in ours. So I'm not suggesting that the indigenous people understood science the way that we understand science, but they understood very well relationships, and their relationships to their own bodies, to one another, to the earth, and to the cosmos. And they incorporated those understandings into their lives. And almost universally, music plays a very powerful role in all of those things. So I discovered my first trip into southern Peru, for example. I happened to be in Peru during a revolution in 1989. Those of you in the audience that are Peruvian, you know that's when the revolution happened. And I didn't know the language when I went there, but I live in the high desert of the American Southwest. And every indigenous culture that I've ever visited, I collect two things. I collect the tea that they drink. I'm fascinated by tea and the culture and the mystery of tea. And I collect their flutes, because every culture has a flute. Some of them are clay, some of them are steel, some of them are made of bone, some are made of soft woods or hard woods. So when I went into Peru, and the first time I walked into a market, and I didn't understand the language, Quechua. I didn't understand, to this day, I'm not a fluent Quechua speaker. I pulled out a wooden flute, a 5-hole red cedar wooden flute made by a Native American man in Taos, New Mexico. And I began playing that flute. And this is a culture who is attuned to the power of sound and music. And without saying a word, there was a man sitting under a poncho. He was just sitting there with a poncho listening. And he got up and he went into a shop and he came out with a full-size concert harp. And he set that harp next to me in the plaza. And I was playing an A. It was an A-sharp flute. And he began to accompany me without saying a word on this harp. And all of a sudden, people gathered around, and all of a sudden they were making a recording of this. And to this day, he and his family are my friends, and I see him every time I go down there, and we now know enough language we can communicate. But our first friendship was based upon the power of the sound that we created together, rather than any formal language, spoken language. And I'm just sharing that as an example of the power of sound to unite and to cut through the red tape and the barrier of language in a way that is so universal that it's accepted throughout the world. So another long answer to a short question.
No, and that was actually in terms of replenishing yourself and then how that's serving others. The next thing I wanted to speak. Do you want to speak a little bit more to that?
Oh, yeah. So to the replenishment part, what I know is this: if I'm writing a book, or if I'm trying to create something, and if I get too mental about it, if I get up and walk into my studio, my music studio, and pick up a guitar, and I immediately shift from my brain into my heart, a couple things happen. First of all, I will feel a rush of energy. And it's one of those things, words probably don't do it justice, Geraldine, but I think we've all experienced it. I feel a rush of energy that it more than replenishes, it is a regenerative, a rejuvenating feeling. And the second thing that happens is because I stop thinking about what I'm trying to do, it comes to me just like that. So when I stop trying to bring it through, move into my heart, what happens is, and there's a phrase that I use all the time to describe what's happening. And the phrase is simply this: I become empty so that I can become full. People ask me all the time when I walk out onto a stage how I remember everything that I share from the stage. And I say, I couldn't possibly remember. And if I did, it would be scripted. So I know what my pictures, what the slides are going to be that I'm going to show you. I have no idea what the words are. And if you watch some of the films, as I'm walking from behind the stage up to the microphone, you will actually see me say this mantra: I become empty so that I can become full. Through me, thy will be done. That's my mantra. And by becoming empty, I become a very rich container, fertile for whatever seed is going to be planted in that moment. And it allows me to be very present with the people that I'm with, so that I can attune to that group and where they are in that moment, rather than having a set script and a set presentation that I dump upon every audience, wherever I go. That would never work for me. So the music, the sound, and I always have a song that I'm listening to. I've got a playlist. I collect music from all over the world. And I have a playlist that I use in my preparation before I go on stage. It begins days before, and even hours in my hotel room before I ever walk out of that room. I'm not taking any phone calls. I'm not answering any knocks at the door. I am fully present with myself so that I can become empty, and the music helps me to do that. So it is very regenerative and very, very replenishing. I'm a night person, so I usually, people say, when do you have time? They look at my schedule. They say, when do you have time to write your books? And I say, well, my books are usually written between about 11 at night at 3 or 4 in the morning. And what I know is at midnight, if I'm even feeling a little bit tired, if I go in and play a song on my guitar, I get that rush of energy, and then that's going to fuel me through a writing session or some kind of a creative session, that's going to carry me through for however many hours it carries me through. So yeah, I'm just going to add, Geraldine, you're an awesome musician. Do you have the same? I don't get to ask other musicians this. Do you feel the same thing? Do you feel that rush of some kind of mysterious energy that just like and helps you to be very present in the moment when you begin playing or singing?
Absolutely. I mean, I just adored hearing you describe it, because it's the same feeling. And as you were sharing, I had a moment of recollection of standing on the stage of the Munich Philharmonic, almost 3,000 seat house. And there was no room to have fear when you go in your mind, but just to drop down into the silence, knowing that everything you've prepared or everything you are will be expressed in that music. There's this rush of a power that's so much bigger than who we think we are.
It is. I appreciate what you're saying so much. When if I ever consciously thought about the audience that was in front of me, I probably would freak out. When I remember the very first time I had a large audience, really, it was Hamburg, Germany, and I think there were 3,000 or 4,000 people that were in the audience. And I was walking with our tour manager through an underground tunnel that led up to the stage rather than walking down through the audience. And as we got closer to the tunnel, I could hear, 3,000 or 4,000 people in a room, and I didn't know that it was my room. And I thought, wow. I said, what are all those people? I hear all these people. I said, I wonder what's going on here. He said, that's your audience. They're waiting for you. And the moment he said that, I felt this moment of panic. And I learned it's not about me. And when I can get out of my head about what I'm doing and move into my heart and love my audience, and I think that's the key, Geraldine, is to be present and to love the people that have come to share some time together. In the presence of that love, there's no room for ego, and there's no room for any kind of fear. There's only room for that moment. And when I'm on that stage, and as a musician, singing and playing guitar, or speaking as an author and a presenter, I think you can probably identify with this. In those moments, all that exists in my world are those moments. There is nothing else. Nothing else, no matter what's happening in my life or my family or my friends or my career, anything. All that exists is that connection and that relationship in that moment. And music is a very, very powerful way. And I'd recommend any speaker or any presenter or any musician, if you haven't discovered this, to find the music that moves you on a soul level. The music, and it's different for everyone, but find that sound that carries you beyond your personality, that carries you beyond your ego, and allow that sound to serve you in the presence of those that you've come to serve.
It connects you to, first of all, you have to be absolutely present. You have to just be absolutely present, as you said, in the emptiness, in order for the creation to come through you. And what you said earlier too, it drops you from the thinking mind where fear sits into your heart, but even deeper than that, Greg, I experienced that it drops me into my soul, whatever that means. It drops me into that place of complete fullness.
Yeah. Yeah. So other than that, it's just a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun, and I was laughing because when you were describing Memorial Hall when you were little, that I'm almost positive that was the theater we played in. I was a young person. I did My Fair Lady with Rex Harrison. I was the youngest in the cast, and we toured the United States, and then we came back and played on Broadway. And in that theater, there was a rock concert the same night, and I'll never forget. They divided the space, and I'll never forget the walls shaking, and we could hear the rumbling and the bass and of this huge rock concert. I think it might have been Aerosmith while Rex was on stage. It was
well, so there's more to my story. That was in 19, I guess it would have been it was sometime in the 60s. So I met Grace Slick from the Jefferson Airplane. She now owns an art gallery with her daughter in South Florida. And I went in one day and I met her, and I told her, I said, I confessed my love to you in the 60s, and you completely blew me off. You completely discounted me. And she was very sorry. She says, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And then the conversation went from there. So it's a whole nother workshop.
Well, I want to come back to a moment. Also, you started with speaking about your work with the indigenous peoples, and I know that's something you're very passionate about. And the story you shared about the harpists just joining you and creating these emanations of sound that were healing and beautiful for all who were listening. How do you experience in the depth of your work? How do you experience how the indigenous cultures, indigenous people used music, sound, chant to connect themselves to earth, heaven, to their experience of life and the universe?
Well, that's a beautiful question, Geraldine. I think maybe the best way to answer that, and we didn't rehearse any of these, so this is all spontaneous. This is a dance, and I'm following the woman who's leading the dance here. My first journey into Tibet in the 1990s. Tibet was very accessible to me, and it was possible to take groups in a way that is not possible today. They don't allow us to do the same things anymore. So for about 12 years, we were going into a series of 12 monasteries and 2 nunneries between Lhasa and the High Pass, and interacting directly with the monks and the nuns and the abbots in their environment, which is very different than bringing them to the States, and doing an interview, or, you're actually in the monastery and you're sitting. I mean, our group, we would be sitting between the monks, 400 monks in the monastery, as they were doing their tantric chants, and you just feel it reverberate through every cell in your body. I mean, it was an awesome experience. And I had the opportunity, and I've written about this, I had an opportunity to have a personal meeting with the abbot, who is the highest ranking official at the particular, any one monastery. They all have an abbot that oversees the monastery. And I asked him through our translator a question that I'd wanted to ask for a long time. I was writing a book at the time called The Divine Matrix, and it was about the field that connects all things, and the science that tells us that field is there. And I was asking him a question. I said, when we see your prayers on the outside as observers, what's happening on the inside? When we see you chanting for 12, 14 hours a day, when we see the mudras and the mantras and the bells and the bowls and the chimes and the gongs, and we smell the incense and we hear all that, when we see those prayers on the outside, I said, what are you really doing on the inside? Because this is something you can't get from the writing or the paintings on the temple wall. Only from one human to another can you convey this kind of information. So I want to take advantage of the opportunity. And this is the man that said to me through the translator, I said, what are you doing when we see those prayers? He said, you've never seen our prayer. He said, because a prayer cannot be seen. What you see are the things that we do to create the feeling, and the feeling is the prayer. and this is very, very powerful for me to hear this. He said, all the things you described, the chanting, the bells, the bowls, the chimes, the smell of the incense, the mantras, those are not the prayers. He said, those are what we do to create the feeling, and it was all about achieving the feeling. He said, the feeling is the prayer. Then he turned the question right back on me, and he says, well, how do you do this in your culture? And it was interesting because in our culture, and there are always exceptions to this, but in general, typically in the Western culture, we're taught that if we say the right words at the right time of day, the God is great prayer before a meal, or now I lay me down to sleep before we go to bed, or if we say the right prayer, on Christmas Day or whatever it is, if we say the words, we're conditioned to believe that we have offered the prayer. And for so many people, nothing happens when they say the words, so they lose faith in their ability to pray and in the power of prayer in their lives, when in fact, the words are not the prayer at all. The words are the code that is designed to elicit the emotion and the feeling, and it's the emotion and the feeling that's the prayer. So this is one of the things I found that this first, it was explained to me through the Tibetan monk. And as I visited the other traditions, the same thing is true. When I'm with when I was in Nepal, in the ceremonies they go through, or in India, or the indigenous people here in the American desert Southwest, or the Aboriginals in Australia, or the Quechua in Bolivia, or the shamans in the Andes, or in the Mayan culture, they're all using sound, but the purpose of the sound is it's like a bridge between the worlds, and it is also designed to connect with us in a way that induces the feeling, the vibration within us, so that we become that bridge, we become that connection. And that's something I had not heard described in quite that way. I again, very conservative upbringing in the Midwest. I was always taught that if I say these words, then I'm saying a prayer, and your prayer is done. So you sit down and you say the words, and now you get up and leave, and your prayer is over. In the indigenous traditions, the prayer is something we become rather than something that we do. And that's a huge difference. You become that feeling. And to the best of your ability, you hold that feeling and you carry it with you throughout the day, rather than being something you do for a couple of minutes and you get up and walk away from. Very, very different way of thinking.
Very different way, because there's a different kind of presence. That in a certain way, if you're doing something that's more by rote, it's a whole different energetic around it.
Yeah, I agree exactly. And this is what we've been taught, by rote. It's a beautiful way to say that. You just say the right words and something's supposed to happen. And I got to tell you, when I was a kid, I said a lot of prayers and nothing happened. And I began to lose faith in my ability. I said, maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm not good enough, to be rewarded, or maybe I'm not good enough to ask for whatever it is that I'm asking for, the healing or the peace in my family, or whatever it was. And it wasn't until I was an adult I realized, although it was well-intentioned, I wasn't communicating with the universe in a language that the universe recognized, and a language that was optimal for the universe. And we are wired for that language through our hearts. It's a language of feeling and emotion, and music is the powerful, powerful bridge between what just happened a moment ago in my life and where I can be in the next moment. Music is the bridge that can get me there. And once I'm there, then it's my choice. Do I choose to hang on to that feeling, to retain what the music has given to me? So the music is this powerful, powerful tool that carries me into this space. Now, once I'm in that space, even if the music is no longer there, my workshop then is to develop the ability to maintain the emotion that holds me in the space the music brought me into. And what I found is when I do the really deep work with the shamans, this is exactly what they're doing. They don't say it in these words, but this is precisely what they're doing. The music, and the monks and the nuns in Tibet, that's why they're in there 12 and 14 hours of chanting to create, and they are definitely in an altered state. I mean, if you're in there with those monks and those nuns, you know, they're not talking about, hey, how's the weather? You know, they are in a very, very, they're conscious, they're present, but they are in a very altered state. And the music is the key for them. The music either externally or the music they create with their own voice or a combination. Now the metal bowls that when I was in Tibet, they were primarily the metal bowls, and these were the old bowls. They were 500-600 years old. And they're very mysterious because they're a combination of either 3 or 5 metals, right. The formula of which was lost during the revolution, 1959. Many of those monks were and nuns were either killed or they were exiled. And the science to creating that metal largely has been lost. I think there are places, pockets, where it's still retained. But we were going to the monasteries and the young monks were asking us for the formula for the bowls because they said, this is something we've lost. But it is those bowls, that's why they're so powerful, because the metals they're using, and they're hand hammered, they're not machined. So they're hand hammered into these beautiful resonant cavities. And the metals that they're using, the molecular structure and the atomic structure of the metals they're using in the shape that we find them create this powerful resonant sound that reverberates throughout the human body. And in some cases, it actually brings the body, it can bring the body into a synchronization or into phase with those sounds for the purposes of healing or creating altered states.
I know I was able to travel with one of our guests, one of our speakers, Kevin James, who's a beautiful musician and leads chants all over the world, but mostly in Europe and Asia. And Bhutan was incredible. We were in the Rinpoche temple when they were the night that they were coming off of a 3-week period of chanting 24 hours. Wow. And the sounds in that temple, Greg, I've never in my life experienced part of it like a cacophony, but it was doing exactly what you described. And then we also had the pleasure of visiting a nunnery, and to really hear the nuns singing, it was a whole different experience. Incredible.
Yeah. You know, when the first time the nuns asked us, we visited only 2 nunneries, 12 monasteries and 2 nunneries over about 26 days is typically the tour. And it takes that long to get up to some of the higher elevations, 17,000 feet above sea level. And the first time the nuns asked us to come in to the chanting hall, they asked if we had time. They said, do you have time to share a chant with us? And it's like, you know, we just come halfway around the world and we've acclimated to, 16,500 feet. Of course we have time. And I had never heard the nuns chant. And I'd been around a lot of monks, and it's the deep, rich, guttural tantric chants. And when the nuns begin their chant, it doesn't sound anything like the monks. It's what we would typically call a song because of the feminine voice. And there were people in the group, as they were listening to the nuns chant, they were asking me, when does this song end and the chant begin? And I said, this is the chant. So it's a very, very different way of thinking about and of listening to the power of the human voice to create the sound to carry us into these spaces. Geraldine, do we have time? Can I just give another example beyond?
Oh, yeah. We're very good. We're very good.
Beyond Tibet. In my early journeys into southern Peru, into the Andes of southern Peru, I began talking to some of the indigenous people, and they have with them what are called Peruvian whistling vessels. And I'm sure you've seen these before. Either, I didn't know we were going to have this conversation, or I would have one here with me. But they're either single or dual chamber vessel. And when you blow into the whistling vessel, it makes one continuous sound. And what was so interesting about this is that there were 7 unique cultures in the southern Andes. So for example, there was Chavin culture and the Nazca culture and other cultures. And depending on their geographic location, they had different clay that they would use to make their vessels. So each culture would make and had a template to make one particular vessel that made one particular tone. So the Chavin vessels are the dark clay, and they have one particular tone. The Nazca cultures are more of a terracotta colored clay, and they make a different tone. And it was only when all 7 of the cultures would come together and meet at special times of year. So maybe during a time of an eclipse, for example, or of a harvest, when they would all come together in one place and they would simultaneously tone through their individual vessels, that they would create the 8th overtone that could only be created by the union of those 7 tones. And that 8th overtone was said to be a very, very healing tone. And it was a tone that would support conception, fertility, and peace among the people. But this is an example of the power of sound to actually unify cultures and create peace in a broad geographic area, because the sound was honored, it was acknowledged, it was embraced, it was accepted as part of what they each brought to the union, to the meeting when they came together. Isn't that a beautiful, beautiful story?
Beautiful. I'm just curious, do you think that the 7 has anything to do with the 7 energetic centers in the body, the chakra system?
You know, that was one of my first, and the 8th being the 8th
Right.
chakra.
Right.
I look at patterns and everything, and it was one of the first things that came to my thinking brain. I've never heard it confirmed that way, through the native people, but I wouldn't be surprised if 7 and 3. 3 is a very powerful number. The trilogy, and 7 is a very powerful number. 3 we see playing out everywhere in terms of, even in physics. You see in the atom, you see the proton, neutron, plus and minus, and then you see the proton, the electron, plus and minus, and then you see the neutron is the neutral. Or you see heaven is the condor in South America,
Right.
and earth is the puma, and the serpent is in between. Or in Christian traditions, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Or you see it, a man and woman, and then child until puberty is biologically is neither until they reach puberty, and the chemistry kicks in. So you see this trilogy play in North America. You see the mountain lion and the bald eagle and the serpent in between. So you see that trilogy play out. You see the number 7 play out a lot as well. And one of the really interesting connections that I've seen with this is human chromosome number 7 is where the genetic shift occurred 200,000 years ago when modern humans, anatomically modern humans, first appeared on Earth, fully intact, fully enabled, with the cranial capacity, with the brain, with the heart, the nervous system, and the ability to vocalize as complex language and as song. All of that happened just like that 200,000 years ago. There's no evolutionary path leading up to it. And it's in human chromosome 7 where the genetic shift was made that gives us the ability for complex speech in a way that no other form of life, no primate. Our closest primate relative is a chimp. And we share over 98% of their DNA, but you will never hear a chimp sing Stairway to Heaven, for example, by Led Zeppelin, or you won't hear a chimp create the complex language that we have. They will certainly vocalize, but they don't create the language the way that we do, because that DNA shift did not happen within them. And I'm fascinated by the 75 million years, the DNA among all primates never changed. 75 million years. And all of a sudden, 200,000 years ago, only for humans, a little DNA shift was made that gave us the ability to connect our tongue and our jaw and the part of our brain for language. It didn't happen with any of the other primates. And you would say maybe that's an interesting fluke of biology, except it's exactly at the same time when human chromosome 2 was created from the fusion of two other chromosomes that gave us the neocortex, 6 layers of neocortex, and the human brain, and the ability to self-regulate. So all of these things happened, and it was chromosome 7 that gives us the ability to sing and to create tone and vocalize in a very conscious way, the way that no other form of life can do. So that's 7. Yeah.
That gave access, that's what we're talking about, that gave access to this connection of spirit, of divinity, of a connection of that space to life on Earth.
Absolutely. So the native people have never specifically shared this with me, but as a scientist, as I look for these relationships, the possibility of these relationships, and I see these patterns, I just recognize them. So I'm just sharing one with you. It's not documented anywhere. And I mean, the human chromosome 7 is documented very well in the Max Planck Institute. And yeah, they've done a lot. Well, that's right. It's from your part of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they know the mystery is, why did it happen? And scientists cannot answer that. So one of those mysteries.
Wow. I'm curious, what else would you love us to know about this whole? It's so deep what we're sharing, and it's so it's that added piece of the human evolution. Music is this language that,
you know, I think music probably has it is a universal language. I think it has a great potential for healing and for unifying our world. Recently, this is the year 2018. March of this year, I had the honor of co-facilitating a tour into Israel and the Palestinian areas, both Israel and Palestine, and with a group of about 100 people. We were there for almost 3 weeks. And of all of the amazing history, archaeology, culture, everything that I saw there, I think one of the things that left me with so much optimism for the future of our world was the power of music to unify people who have been taught to be enemies and taught to live in a polarized world. So we would be in the Palestinian controlled areas, Jericho, for example, and Ramallah. And we would see the young people gathering together without any adult supervision around them. These were the young people of their own volition. So they weren't being told to do this. And they would gather in an open area in a park, for example, or near the water in the Sea of Galilee, something like that. And they would bring drums, and they would bring rattles, and they would bring flutes, and Christian and Muslim and Jewish young people would dance and chant and sing common songs together. And they told us, and we went to talk to them, they said, this is the world that we want. We understand, we don't deny the past. We understand what's happened in the past. And we are ready to move forward from this point on, rather than reliving the hurt of the past, is what they were saying to us. And it was the music was the common bond. We're seeing young Palestinian boys and Jewish boys in rock bands together. Or we were seeing all of them, the Palestinian, Jewish, and Christian kids playing sports together. And the sports and the music are the unifying factors that we're bringing them together in the presence of politics and a culture and a history that said that they're enemies. So, yeah, and that's just one example. I saw the same thing happen back in the 1990s when we had political leaders, and there was a threat that Iran and Israel were going to come to a war. And the leaders were the ones that were polarized, but the people themselves began using the new social media that was just coming into vogue. And the Jewish people were sending social media to the Iranians saying, Iranians, we love you, and we will not hurt you. We don't even know you. How can we hate you? We don't even know you. And it was the music that was bringing them together. And the Iranians were writing back to the Israelis saying, Israelis, we love you. We don't want war. And they said, what's going to come from this is, they said, it's the people of Iran, the people of Israel will lead the world to peace. not to the war, and it was music that was bringing them together. So that's beyond the simple enjoyment that we find, and beyond the good feeling that music can bring to us. I think music has the power to become a catalyst that brings the world together as a common denominator that we can begin with. We all need something common in our humanity. And in addition to life and children and wanting good things for our families, music and food, culture, art, very powerful things, catalysts to bring us together. Music is playing a dominant role in that way.
And I was able to sing in Eastern Germany shortly after the wall came down. And
Wow.
they had never heard, I sang for them Somewhere Over the Rainbow. They had never heard that music before. And to watch music be the bridge to begin to open hearts was phenomenal, was a phenomenal.
Well, and just the way to many people, it looked on the outside like that wall came down very, very quickly. And it was fast for the physical wall, but the energy leading up to that had been percolating under the surface, but it wasn't so obvious to the casual observer. I think precisely the exact same thing is happening right now. The energy to transcend the hurt of our past, the energy to transcend, to become more than the conflict that we've all seen in the 20th century and even before. I think that energy is percolating under the scenes. And I think just the way that wall came down very, very quickly, the way we think of conflict and war in our lifetimes will become obsolete in our lifetimes because no one wins any longer. It used to be that war and conflict, there were winners and losers. And we know today we're globalized and the technology promises that everyone loses in the presence of a war. So I think that we're seeing that and it's percolating under the scenes. And music is one of the ties that keeps the conversation going. As we keep sharing the music and doing like you did, touring music into cultures who've never had this kind of music before, and that brings people together. I had an experience in Tibet. We were at a Tibetan monastery, and there were a group of Chinese students that were there, and they were surprised to see us. There weren't a lot of Westerners in this part of the world. And they wanted to test their language skills. So they asked us, they said, are you Australian? And we said, no. And they said, Canadian? And we said, no. And they said, are you American? And we said, yes. And their eyes got really big. And we had this whole conversation. And they said, you're not like what they told us you would be like. They said, you're much nicer than they told us. And I asked them, I said, well, why are you even here? And they said, the internet has told us that these old temples exist, but in our schools, we're taught that they don't exist, and we want to see for ourselves. And so it was the Tibetan chants that brought their group and our group together. So that was the catalyst that initiated the conversation so that we could find out that we're really very similar and not so different as our culture and our media was telling us. And it's just another example. I think that's the way it works.
You're making me think of, I got to travel last year to Cambodia and participate in a project called Cambodia Sings, where they're really bringing 1,000 children together a week to sing together and to begin to heal the wounds of their history.
Wow.
Then to play also the crystal bowls and to have people tone, don't need to speak the same language, to just tone, hum together with the bowls holding the space was also, it's amazing. It's amazing what the power of music can do.
Well, it is, and I want to thank you for bringing this summit together, and I'm honored to share this virtual stage with so many of my dear friends and colleagues in such a powerful way. And I think this is a very, very important summit. So I want to thank you for our time together today, Geraldine, and thank you for inviting me to contribute. And we didn't know where this was going to go, and did we cover the material and say the thing?
One last thing. So at your conference, From Chaos to Coherence with Bruce, we played sound bowls and you led a meditation outside in nature.
Yes.
And that was very profound. I know you're working on a project, the Global Coherence Project. It was very profound to feel and to be given feedback about the stillness and the depth that happened as a result of your meditation and the sound of the bowls behind it. Will you speak a moment about that?
I will. I have to say, I have another interview in just a few moments, so I've got to go, but I want to honor this question because I think it's important. What the science is showing is that there is, in fact, a field that connects all things, and the field understands coherence or chaos, not the intentions necessarily underlying what we do. And as we went through a guided process to acknowledge our relationship to the elements that give us life, you were playing in a really, I don't know how much you had planned to do the sounds or if they were spontaneous, but you were playing the bowls in a way that created a feeling in our bodies. And we had a piece of technology that was there that is designed to scientifically measure the field. And what that technology showed is that during the time the bowls were there and we were in that process, the entire field around this group and beyond our group moved from what is called entropy into a lower order of entropy, which is called coherence. So we created a coherent field through the sound that you were creating and through what was happening within our hearts. And it was an awesome experience. Thank you for reminding us of that.
Gregg, thank you for your brilliance. Thank you for your time, for your love. And it was a joy that we could share this conversation.
You're so very welcome. I look forward to our next. Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone supporting this, this virtual conference, and I look forward to our next.